Hi everybody. I'm just going to be briefly discussing the spiral silence theory today. I'll start with some of the beginning and the background of the theory, move into some evidence in past studies that supports the theory. I'll even go over a little bit of the critique, then introduce a potential problem for the theory that the 21st century has sort of created, but then I will hopefully be able to show by the end that spiral silence is still a relevant communication theory even today. So I'm just going to jump right in here. The creator of spiral silence theory is Elisabeth Noelle Neumann. She was a political scientist in Germany in the mid 20th century. She suggested the theory in 1974. The basic premise being that people tend to censor themselves when they feel that their opinion is a minority-held opinion, and that people feel more comfortable expressing themselves when their opinion is a majority-held opinion. So Noelle Neumann noticed initially that one side in political elections tends to get more play than another. She was specifically interested in why the German people implicitly supported the Nazi government of the 1930s and 40s in her home country. And the theory is built on three ideas, essentially. The first being that all people possess a quasi-statistical organ, or quasi-statistical sense, some call it, whereby they can determine what widespread public opinion is. Our textbook authors, Littlejohn and Foss, write that people are not reluctant to make educated guesses about public opinion and have a sense of the percentages of the population for and against certain positions. That is an excellent description of what the quasi-statistical organ is. It not only enables us to discern what public opinion is, but also whether or not our personal opinion is in the minority or the majority. The second key idea is that people fear isolation and that they are aware of which behaviors lead to isolation. The third and final, potentially most important idea in spiral of silence is that people generally believe that minority expression is one of those behaviors that leads to isolation. The media also plays a key role in spiral of silence theory, in that it is through the media that people tend to determine which views are widely held and which views are not. So without the media, it would be very difficult for our quasi-statistical sense to pick up on which ideas are in the minority versus which are in the majority. So moving on to some supporting evidence for the theory, Noelle Neumann initially developed what's called a train test. We all know it as a stranger on a train test. About 3,500 people were surveyed about a lot of issues, the purpose being to determine how willing each person was to discuss each of those issues with a hypothetical stranger on a 5-hour train ride. People tended to opt for discussion when they agree with the stranger, and they tended to opt for silence when they did not agree with the stranger, which obviously is consistent with Noelle Neumann's initial hypothesis. A second study deals with Basque nationalism. The Basques are a people group in Spain who have, for years and years, sought to create an independent state, and there's a specific radical group within the Basque region called the ETA group. They have used violence as a way to secure that autonomous state, killing over 800 Spanish residents over the years. So this study was conducted with people living near the Basque region, in other portions of Spain, and in France to determine how willing people were to discuss the issues. The general consensus was that individuals who perceive themselves as in the minority were much less likely to engage in that discussion regarding the Basque separatist movement, and specifically that radical group ETA. A third study dealt with English becoming the official language in the United States. So people from Miami and from Carbondale in the state of Illinois were surveyed, and again, it was determined that public opinion, media climate, and fear of isolation were all huge factors in determining whether or not the respondents would openly and freely give their opinion, which obviously leads it lends some credibility to Spiral Silence's impact on our behavior. A fourth and final research study was conducted in the mid-90s regarding the first Bush's his presidency and his approval ratings. And the study found that as Bush's approval ratings fell, his supporters became less and less willing to openly support him. So the results were actually so overwhelming that researchers do think that there was a causational relationship there. All right, now moving into some critique that Spiral of Silence theory has garnered over the years. The first, because Noelle Neumann grew up as a girl in Nazi Germany, her idea of what potential consequences of speaking out, the consequences of isolation, were pretty severe. You could be put to death, sent to an internment camp. So a lot of critics felt that really wasn't applicable to other places in the world. Some other critics still felt that Noelle Neumann actually believed that the Spiral of Silence was necessary in social progress. That obviously didn't sit very well. We like the idea that open expression is what leads to progress. A third critique, as you can see, is initially the theory suggested that all people would be affected by public opinion in a similar way, and we would express that impact in the same way as consistent with Spiral of Silence. Critics brought up a lot of exceptions to the theory, leading Noelle Neumann to actually amend her original hypothesis to include the exceptions, the radical people who will say whatever, whenever, regardless of what other people think. So I alluded to in the introduction that the 21st century has brought a couple of potential issues for Spiral of Silence. The first being the individualism of the millennial generation. A New York Times op-ed piece explains that the common denominator all millennials share is individualism. They want to spur positive social change and are disinterested in widely supported causes such as environmentalism. Now that is supported by everyone, millennials have sort of distanced themselves and taken up the flag of other causes. The author goes on to say, in the past, people were naturally drawn to mass movements, cults of personality, and nationalistic fantasias, and millennials actually tend to reject those things. So in Noelle Neumann's day, these nationalistic fantasias are what people bought into. Now, this new generation is actually sort of rejecting them. Another potential problem with the 21st century is social media. Some founders of social media actually wanted their networks to provide an alternative forum for open expression of opinion, thus negating or at least lessening the effect of Spiral of Silence. So obviously that poses a problem, and the question that my paper seeks to answer is, given these cultural changes, is Spiral of Silence actually still a relevant theory today? And the overwhelming answer to that question that I found was yes. A study done by Korean researchers studied the willingness of journalists to share their opinions about certain controversial issues in Korea on Twitter. The findings were consistent with the hypothesis of Spiral of Silence theory in that the journalists who felt that their opinions would be accepted by Twitter users were much more willing to express themselves via Twitter. A second study surveyed a number of Southwestern University students on the issue of homosexuality and gay bullying. The results, again, showed the respondents were much less likely to engage in social media discussion regarding gay bullying if they perceive themselves to be in the minority. A third study of the 2013 Italian elections sought to determine whether or not social media did provide an outlet for minority expression in those elections. Results concluded that the Spiral of Silence is in fact still relevant to the concept of public opinion within social media, just as it is within mass media. So that study found that there really wasn't much change between expression on social media and in person. Finally, an extensive survey done by Pew Research was designed to find personal opinions, willingness to discuss the opinions, and personal perception of the views of others on the issue of the Edward Snowden National Security Administration leak. Results showed that people were actually more hesitant to engage in the Snowden NSA discussion on social media than they were in person. The study's author, Keith Hampton, writes this: overall, social media did not provide new forums for those who might otherwise remain silent to express their opinions and debate issues. So in other words, if you were not an exception to spiral of silence before social media, you are not going to be an exception now. In conclusion, a lot of the studies found that although isolation in the 21st century, what that means is very different than it was 40 years ago, people still do prefer to avoid it. As individualism gains more traction, spiral of silence could still be in trouble, and future studies ought to be conducted, obviously. But for now, spiral of silence is alive and well.